Welcome back everyone, long time no see. In today's video we're going to be covering everything you need to know about how to learn and master Dr. Mundo. And before making this guide, I definitely underestimated how impactful this champion can be in a game. Because most of the time when I verse a Mundo, it's one of the easiest matchups of my life. They sit 2 screens away throwing cleavers, I get a pretty big lead most of the time, and then they just group up, behind Dr. Mundo. Pretty useless champion, but after playing him myself and doing a lot of research on how the really high rank Korean Mundos make him work, I definitely found a new understanding of how to be as impactful as possible on this champion, so I'm going to be sharing not just that, but everything you need to know on the champion in this guide. Hey everyone, if you're passionate about improving and leveling up your gameplay, I've been offering coaching classes for 5 days a week for quite some time, and just seen firsthand how much my students have been improving across all different elo brackets. How it works is you'll come to a class with a VOD you like reviewed, and I'm going to help you with your early game, your mid game, or anything you feel like needs improving. And if you're unsure, then I'm going to steer you in the right direction by setting clear learning objectives. Link's going to be in the description, I hope to see you there, but if not, then enjoy the video. First up, we're going to be covering the runes, and the rune page on Mundo is pretty straightforward. He's only got the one, and that is going to be the Grasp of the Undying page. Mundo is one of the best HP stacking champions in the entire game, so all of our runes want to facilitate that, and on the Grasp page, our first rune is going to be Demolish every single game. And even if you're the type of player that likes to experiment and take some fun rune pages, maybe take Phase Rush or Fleet, I still recommend Grasp every time. I do think it's better, but if you want to mess around, I still recommend taking Demolish as your secondary rune no matter what, as it's really hard to get the most amount of value from this champion without it. And as for our second rune, it's going to be either Conditioning, Bone Plating, or Second Wind, so one of the three. And personally, I would never take Conditioning. I believe it's better to have as much laning power as possible and do better in your matchup to gain an advantage instead of taking Conditioning and just playing a bit too passive and relying on the scaling, but you can take it in easy matchups such as Cho'Gath or Ornn. Now, as for the other runes, you can take Bone Plating versus strong all-in champions like Riven or Jax who can't really proc without fully all-inning, and you can take Second Wind versus pretty much any champion that can short trade. So against champs like Aatrox, Gangplank, or Kennen, you definitely need Second Wind on this champion. And for our final rune, it's going to be Overgrowth every single game no matter what, as it's really going to help you get a lot of extra HP and also meet your Warmog's threshold. And as for our secondary runes, it's going to be the Inspiration Tree every single game no matter what, with Approach Velocity, as that's going to really help you stick onto your opponent once you hit your Q, and Free Boots as well for that extra free scaling, but extra free gold. And we'll touch on it more in the item section, but you want to be rushing your Warmogs as fast as possible in the majority of your games, so you don't really want to be delaying that for buying your boots. You don't want to be slowing down your Warmogs by 300 gold. And as for the rune shards, you're going to be taking attack speed and double scaling HP. Now you can choose to take 1 scaling HP and 1 flat HP in really difficult matchups early on, so maybe against champs like Darius or Riven you might want that extra beef early on, but I would still recommend just going double HP stacking, double scaling HP, because your champion is so weak early game regardless, it's very rare you're going to get a kill 1 to 3, but I would take the flat HP rune into some more easy matchups, maybe like a Cho'Gath or a Vlad, where you can play for kills, although it is pretty rare that you will get a solo kill 1 to 3 on Mundo. If you have enough HP level 1, it's going to increase your chance to do so. Moving on to our summoner spells, and spells are also pretty straightforward on Mundo, as you're going to be taking TP every single game no matter what. Mundo is one of the weakest early game champions in top lane, especially 1 to 3, so if you don't have TP, you're going to find yourself in a lot of scenarios where you're stuck under your tower, low HP, and you can never get a recall off and get back to lane without missing a massive wave, so you definitely need TP in the early game in the majority of your matchups, but even in the free lanes, so again, matchups like Cho'Gath or Vlad, let's say you don't need Ignite anyway, you can run them down, the Ignite through doesn't change it much, and having TP for the mid to late game is going to be more valuable anyway. And as for our second spell, it's going to be either Flash or Ghost, but I do recommend Flash most of the time, because after the Ghost nerf, the cooldown is so long, that's not that valuable, and also the Dr. Mundo ulti gives you enough movement speed, you don't really need to stack that with Ghost, but there are times where you can take it, and that isn't too heavy range comps, so maybe versus like a Vayne top, or an Aurora, stuff like that, and they have a ranged jungler, maybe a Lilia, really mobile range champions like Graves, then you can take Ghost into really heavy, 4 to 5 range champions, it can be very good, but most of the time, if you're in a standard top matchup, against an AD bruiser, melee bruiser champ, you can just take Flash, so I would take Flash upwards of, I'd say, 80% of your games. Next up we have the item build, and we're going to be starting Doran's Shield every single game no matter what. It's very difficult to play the majority of matchups without this item, so I strongly recommend just building it every game. And as for our first buy, ideally you can get a Giant's Belt on your first recall, that means you're playing quite well, but if you're against a good laning player, or maybe just a hard matchup in general, a Ruby Crystal or 2 with a refillable is going to be great also. Now, as for our first item, you do want to be going Warmogs most of the time, but something I want to advise against, I see this mistake pretty often from my below Platinum students, you don't want to be building the components, you want to be building purely HP. So Giant Spouts and Ruby Crystals, you don't really want to be spending 400 gold on the Moon Plate, as you're spending 400 for 5% movement speed, where in lane it doesn't really matter that much, it's not as gold efficient. Well, not as effective, I would say, as 150 HP from an extra ruby, and same with the Crystalline Bracer, just a little bit of health regen, completely useless. Just stack HP, get your Giant Spell, get your ruby crystals, and there will be some games where you might have to build the Moon Plate or the Bracer, but you should never opt into it. You should build purely HP, and then try to get your Warmogs as fast as possible. Now, although Warmogs is the biggest spike on Mundo by far, you can't really activate it with just the Mogs. You need to have all the runes we touched on before, and a Doran Shield plus an extra Ruby Crystal, so never sell your Doran Shield to get your Warmogs. I made that mistake once before, never again. You need to have the D Shield, 1 Ruby, and the Mogs to activate the passive, but once you have that, you can be one of the strongest units on the map. There might be some timers you can't activate it without the Ruby if you're having a really bad game and you're, high level, getting that extra HP from Overgrowth and the runes. But most of the time, if you're having a good Mundo game, you're going to get your Mogs at level 9. So if you can get the Ruby Crystal as well, level 9, level 10, you're going to be one of the strongest units on the map. Now you can, however, go the Hard Steel as your first item in certain scenarios. I personally prefer Warmogs most of the time, because it can really help you play so aggressive. When you have Warmogs, you can play right in somebody's face, you can break tower in front of them, and if they chunk you to low HP, you just back off and regen it back, so it really helps you be as aggressive and pressuring as possible. But you can go hard steel in games where you're versus a side laning champion that's going to be fighting you quite often. So if you verse a champion like a Jax, or maybe a champ like Fiora, you can just fight them back, and the extra damage and stacking from hard steel can feel pretty good, but in games where you're ahead. But if you are behind, I'd still recommend going Warmogs as fast as possible, even in those type of strong side laning matchups. Now, as for your boots, in the past it was pretty easy, build tabbies against AD top, Mercs versus AP, stuff like that, Swifties because they're cheap, but because of the boots nerf, they feel quite terrible to buy, so I actually advise against building boots early until you have your Warmogs and Heartsteel, because Heartsteel is a stacking item, you want to be trying to get that also very quickly, so you go Warmogs into Heartsteel most of your games, so if you upgrade your boots, you are going to delay that spike. But there are going to be games, of course, where the boots are very valuable, so if you verse like an Olaf or a Nasus, you can go Swifties, it helps you a lot in the side lane, or if you verse, Quinn top, with a Graves jungle, really heavy auto attack based champions, Tabbies, or like a Gragas top Lilia jungle, Merc treads are going to be great, but don't just build it like, oh, I'm this Renekton, I'll go Tabbies. It really needs to be extremely valuable to be worth delaying your Heartsteel for a tier 2 boot, so mainly around the enemy top jungle or top jungle mid, if it's going to give you a lot of value. So another example around top jungle mid would be maybe, Quinn top, Akshan mid, and then their junglers just like Lee Sin, or even like a Sejuani or something. Tabbies would still be great in that type of game, because you're going to be auto attack quite a lot by the multiple 80, 380 carry threats on their team, so it could be worth delaying. But most of the time, if you verse normal Renekton Italy, something like that, then you can just go Warmogs Heartsteel and sit on the tier 1 boots. And expanding on our second item a little more, the only scenarios where you would want to delay the Warmogs Heartsteel or Heartsteel Warmogs Rush is going to be when you verse really heavy AP comps. So if you verse like a Kennen top, Lilia jungle, maybe a Brand jungle, Gragas or Gwen or something like that, you can go Warmogs as your second item, especially against a Gwen with an AP jungle. Gwen is a health shredder, probably one of the hardest matchups for Mundo. We'll touch on matchups later, but it's going to be very valuable to build a strong MR item in that scenario. Or you can go Bramble Vest. Don't upgrade the full Thornmail, just go Bramble into, champs like Aatrox or Fiora. Auto attack based insane amounts of healing. That can be quite useful as well, especially against Fiora. But I'd say most of the time it is going to be their Warmogs Heartsteel Rush. So if you're ever unsure what to buy, and default to that, it's going to work in the majority of your games. Now, as for our third item, this is where you start to get a lot more options, and I would recommend going Hullbreaker in games where you're against an opponent that it's very easy to break the tower in front of them. So most tanks, champs like Cho, Ornn, Sion, if you do very well, if you've got a slight lead against them, you can actually demolish the tower in front of them with Demolish and Hullbreaker. You're going to get that tower done pretty much in 1 minion wave, so it's really pressuring to play against, and the mid game's going to expand on how to get the most value out of it. But if you can, against these AP champs like Vlad or Rumble as well, and you get a lead, Hullbreaker is going to be a great third item, because it's very hard for them to deal with the enhanced cannon and one-shot the wave or block it in front of the tower. But some alternatives, if you feel like it's not a split pushing game, you just want to be grouping up, or maybe they have a strong, AD threat inside, you're not really going to be able to pressure tower against, then you can go either Unending Despair or Spirit Visage. So Visage would be great against heavy AP comps, again like a Gwen or AP jungle, stuff like that. Visage is going to be great, or Unending Despair if you need the armor, so if they have maybe, let's say Renekton top, and then an AD mid or a strong AD carry, something like that. You know, a bunch of melees, especially underneath the spear, gives you a ton of value. So if you see AD top jungle and they're both melees, then Despair will be a great third item. But you can also go Thornmail, especially if you win Brambleverse early on, upgrade it from this point, as it's going to be a lot cheaper than a full item from scratch, especially in games where you need the healing cut. Or you can go Randuins in games where there are multiple crit chance users, so if they have a Yone top or a Yasuo mid, something like that on top of their traditional AD carry, then you can go Randuins as well. You get a ton of value from that item. Sunfire is an item I personally don't like, but I have seen it quite a bit, and that's going to be good again into a bunch of melees, especially when you want to be just pushing side and moving around, but I prefer Underneath Despair. I think it's more useful than Sunfire, but it is an option, especially if you like how it feels. And as for Jaksho the Protein, I would almost never build this as my third item. The only scenario where I see it being good is when they have a pretty perfect, split of AD and AP damage, because your first two items are HP. You don't really have any resistances, so picking up Jaksho third can help if they have maybe a strong Hui and a strong Aatrox or a strong Graves or something. Then it can be great to pick up the Jaksho, but most of the time you are going to be building one of the three items on the top row, highlighted that, with that green square. And to round off your build, same reasoning for all of these items, but I do recommend picking up a Jaksho as your final item in games where you already have a resistance item of each type. So for example, if you have Unending Despair and Spirit Visage, great combination of items by the way, as the extra healing from Despair will get enhanced by Visage, you can pick up a Jaksho last and get a lot of value from these items. But in games where you feel like you're lacking damage, you can pick up a Titanic Hydra, and especially after you have 3 or 4 HP items, this is going to give you a lot of extra damage if you feel like your team comp is lacking the damage needed to, wipe the enemy team. And down below, I've got a couple examples of full builds. You can see the tank one has a Jaksho last with an Armor Name R item. That's generally what it's going to look like. And the split pushing item, you don't have to go the Hullbreaker with Titanic Hydra. It's just an example. You can just go Hullbreaker third, blow up all the tier 2s on the map, get accelerated that way, and then build normal tank items if you want to be grouping. It's just an example of in games where you feel like team fighting's not really an option and you want to be winning heavily through side. Up next, we're going to be covering the laning phase, and to be honest, Mundo is one of the weakest laning tops in the game, especially early game, but that doesn't mean you don't have any options. In any hard matchup you play, or even in some decent ones, there are going to be timings where you do just have to sit far back and farm with your Q. But that shouldn't be your default every game, every matchup, no matter what. So I'm going to show some examples of matchups where you have more room to punish them. So in this game, I'm playing up against a Vladimir, one of Mundo's easiest matchups. So you can see already, I've been trying to fish for Qs level 1. I'm not just walking in with my wave playing passive like I might do versus Darius. I was hunting for him in the jungle, got some Qs, and my jungler kind of, dropped the ball here, and he got killed. Not really my issue. So you can see now, I decided to tank the empowered Vladimir Q so that I could get a Q and a grass proc, because even though we're trading damage, the trade's relatively equal. I've got Doran Shield, Second Wind, and my passive regen, so I'm not afraid to trade damage in this matchup, and I know I'm going to get prio anyway, so I'm not really afraid at all to, make it a bit dirty and really hard trade with him. We can see shortly, I'm going to get level 2, and I'm going to look to kick the E into him. He spaced it out. The E range is not really that long, so I should have waited for him to come a little bit closer, but I'm fine with just pushing that minion through a couple creeps and trying to get prio as I want to look for a bigger trade. So now, I decide to tank, I go for a cleaver here, and I decide to tank his empowered Q for a cannon. Not the best trade in the world, but we don't really want to be giving up this cannon for no reason. And again, I've got a lot of regen, not afraid to tank damage, especially against champions that have low all-in threat, where if I was up against a champion they can force onto me, like a Jax or a Fiora, I'm definitely not going to be trading so hard. You want to be conserving HP and farming with Q, but everyone knows how to do that, so I'm going to be showcasing these more matchups where you can push your limits a little bit more. So boom, the second I hit level 3, I run him down, pop Q, and you can see I've got 2 points in Q. You should do this in pretty much every single matchup. The only timings where I would want you to maybe go W is maybe if your wave control messed up, maybe it was in the center, and you're versus a champion that's going to all in you, like a Riven or a Jax. The W can absorb some of that burst, but I would still recommend just defaulting to 2 points in Q in upwards of probably 95% of your matchups. So we can see here, the level 3 trade, just to break it down a little bit more. Random down, Q, auto E. Got to use that E auto reset. One extra auto, because I know I've got time to get him before his empowered Q comes up. And then a fade away Q. So pretty good trade there. And now I'm going to be looking to punish. So I walk up now. I waited for my spells. So here, after this trade, walk back to the minion, keep my grasp stacked up by auto-attacking this minion here, make sure my grass doesn't drop, and then I run towards. So even though I missed the minion, I wanted my grass proc there, and then Q flashy, insta-kill. If I went for the greedy, auto, or ran at him a bit more, maybe he would use his pull. So I went for the instant E, it would follow him in his pull, so I was able to pick up a kill. Now, of course, this is not going to be the norm on Mundo. You're not going to kill your opponent pre-6 in over 90% of your games, but that doesn't mean you can't look for it in matchups that are a bit more close, or, matchups that are favored for you like in this one. Now, next example, it's going to be a lot more realistic than the one we just watched. This game I'm up against a Kled. So pretty good matchup with the Mundo. His Q has a really big healing card onto it. He has a lot of all-in threat, but I'm still able to gain a lead in this matchup in a more realistic fashion than the one we just watched. So now straight away I watered the bush level 1 in case he was cheesing in there, and some of you'll notice is I'm trying to bait out his Q. I went into this matchup trying to staunch towards him and then click away to make him use his Q. So here I pretended to walk up and hit the wave, but really I'm already clicking away, so he's going to throw out his Q most likely, and I'm able to avoid it. So something else you'll notice is I'm hitting the wave straight away. That's for 2 reasons. Even though I know I want to give him push in this lane, I want to hit the wave because I want to stack up my grasp in case he goes onto me. I have my grasp ready to go, but also there's a big difference between giving your opponent push and giving your opponent hard push, where if I didn't touch the wave at all, just last hit or farmed with Q, then he would be able to get level 2 with maybe a 2 or 3 minion advantage, which means I have to sit back here and respect him and wait for 2 or 3 minions to die before I can even walk up. But if I get level 2 with maybe a 1, he gets level 2 with maybe a 1 creep gap, and then I can just walk up blaster to get level 2, he all into me, I can Q auto E, a lot more space in the lane will be created than if he got level 2 with such a big gap. So you can see I'm hitting a lot of Qs onto him. Every time you play Mundo, you should be watching your opponent closely. If they are not using the minion wave as a meat ball, meat shield, then you need to be constantly looking for your Qs. So here, you'll notice, even though he went onto me, I held on to my Q for a little bit. I want to increase my chances of hitting it. So a good, a good kind of rule to follow is always hold your Q for maybe 0.5 seconds longer than normal. Where here, I could just Q him straight away right now, but I want to hold it for a little bit longer and just make sure I can hit it. So here, he goes for my passive, and then I use my Q. So there's a better time to use it because I waited, where if I Q'd the second it was up, there's a decent chance he might have been able to dodge it. And I walk up, proc my grasp onto him, pick up my passive, and now you can see level 2, 1 minion off. So bad cleaver there, I mistimed the minion dying, but I'm able to get level 2 at a relatively similar time to the Kled, and I don't have to sit here really far back and wait for, 2 or 3 minions to die. So now, just catching minions with Q, I don't want to walk up and let him jump onto me with his Q, of course, especially when your passive is down. Kind of similar to Camille, where if you verse a champion with a crowd control spell, like a Jax or a Renekton, you do want to be playing around your passive and not walking up and getting CC'd, and Kled is no exception as well with that pullback from his Q. So you can see now, touching the wave whenever I can, whenever he gives me any space, I'm hitting the wave, and I'm going to be looking for an E on this minion most likely, miss, but able to hit my cleaver. So 2 points in Q here. Walk up, knock him off the horse, proc my grasp as well. Any kind of grasp proc you can get and stack up your max HP that you can get for free, definitely want to be taking that. And then, pushing minions through other creeps to get 2 minions at the same time, 2 or 3, really important as well. So just chilling back here, don't want to give him free stacks of his passive because I want Lee Sin to look for a gank. And now I'm able to E into Q. Another trick you can do as well is if he's using a minion as a meatball, you can kick the minion away if it's low and then guarantee hit your Q, or knock another minion into that minion he's using if it's going to kill it, and again hit your Q. So here, I choose to remount him, because if cleared remounts, and I dismount him relatively quickly, he can't remount for, a period of time, so I want to be knocking him off his horse here and getting Lee Sin involved. So I'm keeping the wave here, or Lee Sin is top, and Kled is respecting here. But you can see already, I'm playing Dr. Mundo, one of the weakest laning champs in the game, but look at my lane state. Even if my Lee Sin is not here, if he's bottom, I'm half HP, getting pushed level 4, and he's like 300, really low HP, he can't all-in me here, so I've got my lane in a scenario that's really good for me, purely 1v1 in this relatively hard matchup early, just from, not shying away, not being afraid to play for push and trade onto him, because if you do that every time, then the wave's going to come back towards the Kled, he's going to be full HP, maybe you might be a bit chunked, and he'll just base TP back, or kill you with his jungler. But if you're trading and getting your lane in a favorable spot, not only is it very easy for your jungler to get involved, like this Lee Sin came, freest kill of his life, but it also gives yourself a lot of space, so even if your jungler doesn't come, you're not in a scenario where you feel pressured. If the wave is here, and I'm half HP and he's maybe full, there's not very much I can do in that scenario. But because I laned very well, not very well, but because I took some great trades in this lane and he got quite low, I gave myself a lot of space, so regardless of what happened with my jungler, I was fine in this matchup and I was able to get level 6 for free. Now, before we wrap up the laning section, I wanted to showcase a couple of examples of how you actually gain your lead on this champion, because it's pretty unrealistic that you do get a lead 1 to 5. The good trades and stuff like I did versus Cleared, if my jungler didn't come, is just going to give yourself some space so you can get to Warmogs without being behind, but once you're at that timer, that's when you really want to start pressuring. So here, I do have Warmogs. I don't have Warmogs Ruby, so I'm not going to get the Warmogs passive going, but I am still relatively strong. So I TP back, insta clear the wave. Even if he base and TP'd, I wouldn't care. My main focus now is blowing up his tower. This is going to be very consistent in the majority of your games of how you gain your lead. So here straight away, bashing the tower. Mundo is one of the best champs in the game at ignoring your opponent and breaking tower for a couple reasons. One, especially with Warmogs, you can just regen all the damage they do back to you. Two, your Demolish does a lot of damage because you have so much HP, but also your passive is very beneficial. So here, even though he's knocking me up, and that'd be the same as a Jaxi or, Camille, doesn't really matter, it's just going to knock my passive off. I'm not going to get CC'd at all, and it's still very easy for me to bash down this tower. I don't really need to be afraid of getting, crowd controlled under tower. And you can imagine here, if I was a little bit stronger, if I had a Ruby, I would just regen all this damage back. So I'd be in a great scenario to continue blowing up this tower. So if I were to base after this wave, which is what I do, after this weird Dr. Mundo, this weird Musty gank, after this play, I base, get a bit of HP, and then I just continue to blow up his tower. So I wanted to showcase one more example of gaining my lead through Demolish Tech, and in this game I actually played pretty poorly. It was pretty early on my Mundo journey, so I was really pushing the limits of my champ, and this Carthus, he actually avoided my ward, he cleared Crab and went around the back, really smart by him, and predicted my flash, right? So bad by me, that I was playing a little bit too high up, and really good by him, but I punished the Cassante's mistake, even though he just received the gank, and I was able to gain myself a lead. So I TP back to lane, and instead of clearing this wave with W and E, I just lasted it very slowly, and I want my wave to bunch up. So you can see my waves coming in, I want it to bunch up and stack and build the biggest wave I can. And the mistake that Cassante made is he didn't TP back to lane. If he TP back here, he can poke me, he can trim the wave and stop this from happening, but you can see I'm just last hitting. So I'm going to skip ahead, you don't have to watch me last hit 10 creeps in a row, but I'm just farming as slowly as possible and looking to really build the biggest wave I possibly can. And then, this Cassante could be playing a bit higher up, but I'm level 6 versus 5, so he doesn't want to really risk it. And now look how big I've got this wave, right? Triple stack cannon wave. It's hard for Cassante to walk up because I'm level 6 with this big wave, and now I'm able to go for a Demolish. So I play bad here as well. I should have just taken the one plate in base. One little tip though, for when you're proccing Demolish, if you can, hit a Q on your opponent before you go for it. So you try to fast push the last wave, this wave here, kind of as fast as you can, because you don't want the next wave to be coming in and blocking your Qs as well, or blocking your wave. So here I get rid of the wave and I Q him before I go in, not just to chunk him and slow him, although that is nice, but also to proc your approach velocity, so you can get near this tower, use the movement speed a little bit easier to maneuver around. And now even though Cassante can W me, I'm not afraid because I've got my passive. So I should have backed out now. I created pressure. I got 1.5 plates. I can get that second plate later. And Carthus got Void Grubs in front of me. So I'm just really pushing the limits here. I don't really recommend it. It's very obvious I'm going to die. But you can see, even though I've been ganked twice already, I've gone 2 plates. Kind of like the boss style of gameplay, I'd say. But it's just unnecessary. I can get these plates and, snowball without dying here. You can see I could have just taken 1.5. And then this was the way I won the game. I did blow up the tower, but I died a couple more times. And I was able to snowball and come back from a pretty big deficit. So you can see the main way you're going to be getting leads on this champion is from building big waves and proccing your Demolish, especially once you have Warmogs. Because Cassante is not the hardest matchup in the world, and this guy wasn't, the best Cassante player around. But if you verse a matchup that's a little bit harder, you might need to wait for your Warmogs or Warmogs Ruby, but once you have that, you should be playing really aggressive, and because your HP will be so high, you can generally break 2 plates at a time with your Demolish. Moving on to abilities, tips, and tricks. Now, as for your maxing on Mundo, you're going to be putting 3 points in Q into E max first, and then finish off the 2 extra points in Q and W max last. So now making sure you put that 2 points in Q for lane, so Q, then E, then a second point in Q, before you get that point in W. Now, something to keep in mind as well, for your items, once you have Titanic Hydra, the damage of course scales off your max HP, so if you get to low HP first and then use ulti to increase your max HP, your Titanic Hydra is going to do more damage. So if you can hold it in a team fight for a little bit longer in that late game fight where you have Hydra until you use ulti, it is going to maximize your damage just that little bit. Now, starting with Mundo's passive, it is pretty straightforward, but there are a couple points that I want to touch on. So it will block a crowd control ability and pop off the canister. If you pick it up, you'll get some HP back, and it's going to reduce the cooldown by 15 seconds. Now, that's very important, not really in the early game, it's still great if you can pick it up, of course, but as you can see, I'll put the chart on the screen, once you tick level 16, the cooldown is 15 seconds, so if you proc it and pick it up straight away, you're going to get that passive back instantaneously. So really important you can get multiple passives down in a team fight, especially level 13 or 16, so be very aware of where it lands and pick it up if you can. And one little trick you can do with your passive is if you want to TP somewhere or maybe TP away inside, and they only have one CC ability, you can just proc your TP right in front of their face, and even if they knock you up or stun you or anything like that, your passive will block it and your TP will still go through. Now as for Mundo's Q, it is going to cost a decent chunk of HP when you throw it, depending on what rank the Q is, but if you hit a champion or a monster, you get all that HP back, and if you hit a minion, you get half of it back. So if you throw your Q and you miss a champion, but you hit the creep, it's still going to be fine, but if you miss a champ and a minion, it's going to feel quite terrible, so make sure you're not just throwing it out blindly in the early game, throw them out with a lot of intention. Now, the Q is also going to do percentage current HP of your opponent, so if they're high HP, it does way more damage than it does when they're low, so just keep that in mind if you're ever going for an all-in. And something else to keep in mind, not just for your Q, but all your spells, the damage you take from throwing out your Q, for example, is not going to break your Warmog's passive, so even if you're regenning on Warmogs, you can Q the minion wave, or Q champion, whatever you want to do, and although you will take a little bit of damage, it's not going to break your Warmog's regen, so feel free to use all your abilities when your Warmogs is going, just to make sure you don't get hit by a minion or a champ, or a tower, or anything like that, because that's what's actually going to break your Warmog. Now, as for Mundo's W, a lot of people know that it does damage around you, and you'll store some of the damage taken as grey health, but it's important to know how exactly it works. Where the first 0.75 seconds, so a very short timer, after you activate it, you're going to store between 80 and 95% based on your level of the post-mitigation damage as grey health. So a huge amount of damage stored, but if you use it after, if you block the damage after 0.7, you're only going to store 25%. So that first 0.75 seconds is really important. So if you can use that to block the, full Riven combo, Syndra ulti, anything like that, you're going to get a lot of value from the spell. It's in 4th shot, a lot of champions burst you can react to, so you want to time your W very well, because after that, 25%, it's nothing to sneeze at, but it's definitely not as effective. And after you've stored that damage up, if you recast W, it's going to do a lot of damage around you, scales off your bonus health as well, but you're only going to get 50% back unless you hit a champion with that W. So if you can hit a champion as well, with the W2, the W active, you're getting a lot of that HP back. Moving on to Mundo Z, and the most important part of the spell by far is it is an auto attack reset, so make sure you're not just running at your opponent, QEing them. Take that little bit of extra time to auto E and enhance your damage, especially when you're breaking towers as well. And something a little bit less known about your E is it does more damage when Mundo is low HP. It caps off when you're below 70%, but it'll do an extra 40% damage at that point, so it scales with your missing HP up to 40%, so your E damage will be a little bit higher, well, significant amount higher when you're low HP. And a little trick you can do in lane is you can prime your caster minions to be low, sort of like in Aurelia. So if your opponent's not in lane pressuring you, you can bash down a caster, especially if you're up against a ranged champ, and when they come back, you can knock it straight at them, or you can knock your melee minion into that caster, and the melee in the caster dies, so you have a clear shot to hit your Q. And as for our final ability, Mundo's Ultimate. And the most crucial part of the spell by far is making sure you use it when you're low HP. You're going to get a big chunk of base HP based on how low you are when you use it up to a cap. So making sure you use it when you're as low as possible within reason, right? Making sure you don't die before you get the value from it. But if you can use it when you're below 30%, you're going to get a ton of value from the spell. So something to keep in mind. Because of that, you almost never want to be using the spell to engage within team fights. I see this mistake a lot when Mundos will pop ulti and try to run somebody down, but you want to be leading with movement. Run forward, try to hit Qs, get chunked, absorb all that damage, and then use your ulti at a later point, so you get more value not just from the initial active, but also from the duration as well. And the final point, your ulti level 16 is a huge spike. It's kind of like Cassidy, I guess, where once you hit 16, you're going to be extremely powerful, because once you have level 16, based on how many players are around you at the time, you're going to get an extra 5% value from the base health and the base health regen. So if you pop your ulti in the middle of 5 people at level 16, you're going to be really spiked. So it's a big difference between, level 15 or 14 compared to 16 in terms of your team fighting power. Next up, we have the matchups, and I do want to preface this by saying this is a general tier list for all elo brackets, so there's definitely going to be some variance, where for example, if you're playing versus Sante in Iron or Bronze, probably the matchup's going to be very free and you can blow up his tower, or if maybe you're versing a Yone in High Challenger, the matchup's going to be borderline unplayable. So, but most of the time, they should fit in their category, or maybe a one category difference, depending on your bracket. Now, the other preface I want to say is the even matchup. There's a reason I didn't really say skill matchup. It's because these matchups that I put in the even tier is not really even in the sense where both of you can win it. It's even in the sense where both sides are pretty happy. So if you play Jackson to Mundo, a matchup I've played quite a few times, I'm happy to be the Jax. There's a lot of room for me to make plays against the Mundo. But if I'm playing the Mundo, I'm also relatively happy because my passive can block a Z. I can farm up relatively safely. You know, Jax has no sustain, so if I hit cleavers, there's a little bit of room where I can trade with him, and I can get to my Warmogs relatively unscathed, maybe 10 to 15 CS down if the Jax plays it well. So these kinds of matchups are more so both sides are happy instead of both sides can win it. So starting with the hard matchups, and without a doubt Gwen is the hardest matchup for Mundo by far. This lane is very hard to play. She wins all the trades, she gets pushed permanently, she can take Ignite for all ends, and she can even take Demolish and try to threaten your tower in front of you. And the game doesn't really get easier for you as it goes on compared to another matchup where, you know, Jace is quite hard in lane, but especially if he doesn't take Conqueror, you can get to the point where you run him down inside. Where champions like Gwen, champs like Fiora, they can win the lane very easily. If they make a big mistake or die to ganks, you know, there is a bit of room there, but they can win the lane quite easily and pressure tower in front of you, so those matchups are the hardest in my opinion. Now, Aatrox and Darius are also very difficult, but they can't really pressure the tower in front of you, which is nice, but they do have a lot of kill threat, especially Aatrox around level 7, level 9, where you can pop your passive very easily, where at least versus Darius, you can block his E with your passive, so there's a little bit of wiggle room there. But because Darius wins the matchup so hard early, he can bounce that wave back, ghost you down on wave 4, and if you miss a cleaver, you're probably going to die, so that matchup can be very hard against a Darius that has good wave control. So my advice against these champions, I would say, in general, I do recommend Mundo as more of a counter pick. Anyway, so when you see your matchups are not that bad and Mundo does well in the game, and we'll touch on when he is good in the drafting section, so I wouldn't recommend just blinding Mundo, you know, every game investing Darius or Fiora, champs like that. But if you love playing Mundo and it's your main champ, you can do so. My advice for you is you need to get very good at spacing. So versus Gwen, you can kind of path towards a minion, you know, bait that you're going to go for it and bait out her Q, sidestep in if you can hit a Q as well, or she's doing her Q animation, you have some room to trade. And if you can kind of keep the wave on your side by trying to block the casters from reaching tower, trying to get your jungler involved, it can be a bit easier. And versus Fiora, if you can go early Bramble, you can go Warmogs Bramble or straight Bramble if you base on 800 gold, it can be okay. But generally, I would say get Warmogs first, as that item is such a big spike on you, and her sustain is not that high until she has Ravenous Hydra anyway. Now, as for Darius, I'd say play really heavily around your passive. His E cooldown is much lower than your passive is early game, so make sure you're not walking up and giving him that hook when your passive is up, and every time he hooks you, he should tank a Q and maybe even use that approach velocity to walk in and get an auto grasp. Just make sure you're not giving him 5 stacks under any reason. Now, Aatrox is again all about spacing. You want to be baiting, going for a minion, clicking backwards, trying to bait out his Qs, or close the gap. If you can make him Q1 and you run towards him so the outer ring doesn't hit you and burn your passive, you can keep your passive for his Q2, makes it a little bit easier. But at the end of the day, these matchups are very difficult, so if you can, you know, be down maybe 10-15 CS, play mainly for farming or poking them down with Q and get to your Warmogs unscathed, that's going to be a win in my books. Now, as for your opponent's side of matchups, most of these lanes are going to be very difficult in their early levels, especially 1 to 3, so you have to be very careful and conserve as much HP as possible, because even though you can win your trade level 1, or go even in your trade level 1 versus a lot of them, most of these champs are going to get pushed, so you have to be very careful regardless. So to give an example, let's say you play up against a Set, and you're feeling good, you walk up and staunch him, he E's you, you know, your passive blocks the E, you Q auto him, he punches your head in a little bit, and now you're both half HP. Even though that trade feels good, you might have even won the trade. If he tanked minion aggro, he's the one getting pushed, which means he's got the minion advantage. He's going to be level 2 vs 1, 3 vs 2, so you can't really trade on him after that, and now the wave's going to be bouncing back towards him, when he's the one with more all-in threat than you, and you're also going to be low HP, so it's really hard for you to play the bounce back if you take a big trade level 1, and I learned this the hard way many times. Trading level 1 feels good, but you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot in the future, because when the wave is bouncing out from the tower, and now you're half HP, it's a lot harder for you to crash that wave yourself, because if you can successfully ping-pong the first, you know, set of waves, so they crash wave 3, you build wave 4 and 5 and crash that yourself. If you can do that successfully and have the wave bounce back towards you again, you're going to be fine in the majority of these lanes. Now, some of them do get harder as the lane goes on, like a Rally or a Yone when they spike at Blade of the Ruin King, that can be quite hard. So they win early and they spike hard at Book as well. So these matchups are very difficult. But if you can get to Warmog's Ruby without getting behind, you're still going to have room to play these matchups, because even though they do have a bit of sustain, especially Irelia, that's why she's at the front, she's got a lot of sustain as well. Yeah, you can chunk them, both get half HP and Warmog's that back, you're going to be fine, but getting to that Warmog's part is the hard part, so your goal should kind of be to stay high HP in the early game, or trying to chunk them down with Qs and Es without taking damage in response, so 100 to 0 trading. And if you can successfully crash your own wave, so they crash theirs, wave 3 or 2, you bounce it back and crash your own, you're going to be able to keep ping-ponging these waves, chunking them if you can, and you're going to be fine in the majority of these matchups if you can execute. Now, the agency is on them, so the higher rank you go, the harder this champ is to play, because a lot of these champs can just trade with you, force trades on you early, like Riven, Camille, Irelia, and they can crash the wave and make it come back and pressure you for a kill. But because your opponent's going to make mistakes and you can get a couple cleavers onto them or Es, stuff like that, stay high HP yourself, there is some room that you have to get the wave in yourself by outplaying, but you need to be willing to try to chunk them as much as you can while staying high HP yourself for at least at first levels 1 through 5. Now, as for the even matchups, just like I talked about before, it's not even as in like, oh, if you play better, you can shit on them. Like, no, these champs are probably still going to be favored in the lane in terms of, actually winning the matchup, especially if it was two really high rank players against each other. However, you're pretty happy in these lanes. Up against Gragas, he's not really going to punish you that hard. He can get pushed early, but once you get a bit of beef, level 7, or once you get level 9 with Warmogs, you can start to blow up the tower in front of him if you're not behind. Same with a champ like Ornn. He does a lot of damage early with his W, and even later on his damage gets higher, but you don't care about his damage later on, because you have so much HP, and also you regen it back with your Mogs. So these are the matchups where, especially in the mid game, you can start to blow up the tower in front of them. So pretty much from Warmogs Ruby onwards, you can blow up the tower in front of most of these champs if you're not behind at that point, which is what makes them pretty good. So Urgot, for example, he might be up to EU, your passive will block it completely, you can get your Demolish proc, go away, you might need to pop your ulti, but most of these matchups are going to be fine as long as you can get to Warmog's Ruby without getting behind. But in terms of the early game, they're not going to be as hard as the other matchups that we discussed before. So Jax can be hard, especially if he takes Conqueror Ignite, but your passive blocks his E, because he has a very long cooldown now. I probably would have put him in opponent's sided before if the Jax nerf didn't just come in. But now his E cooldown so long, you have a lot of breathing room when his E's on cooldown to walk up and farm. Every time he Qs on you, you get a free cleaver. So the matchup is not unplayable by any means compared to some of these other ones are really hard. And most of these matchups are going to be quite similar. But if you get Warmogs and Ruby and you're not behind, you can trade a lot of HP with them. You've got infinite sustain, they don't. And then you can start to demolish tower in front of them. Now, as for the Mundo favored and the easy matchups, these are lanes where you can proc your demolish in front of them before you even get Warmogs if you're playing the lane well. The level 1 is pretty weak on every single one of these champs. You don't have to worry too much about it. You can get to level 6 kind of unscathed. And then when you're level 7, with a giant spell, a few points in Q, you can start to staunch them, try to proc demolish in front of them. You might need to pop your ulti, but you can gain an advantage that way. And then as soon as you've got Warmogs Ruby, you're going to completely explode the tower in front of them if you haven't died to a gank or, made a mistake and died 1v1 at that point. Next up, we're going to be covering the mid game, and this is what I truly believe to be one of the biggest differences between the high-rank Mundo players and the majority of Mundos that I see. Now, most Mundos that I see, they'll play quite safe in lane, farm with their Q, get their Warmogs, maybe get a couple items, and group up with their team around Dragon, be that front line, and try to kind of facilitate their teammates. However, Mundo is inherently a selfish champion. I know he doesn't feel like that because you're weak in lane, you don't really ask for resources, and you're a tank. But he's a selfish champion because what do you truly provide for your teammates? You are a frontline, yes, but you don't have any CC, you can't really peel them, and you're so weak in lane that you don't really give your jungler options to snowball off of you. So the reason you're picking Mundo, even because of those, negatives, is because you're very powerful inside. So the way you want to be playing Mundo is to be the most oppressive side lane champion, or one of the most oppressive side lane champions in the game. Where here, you can see I'm playing purely for side, I'm not interested in what's happening around the map, and I'm looking to break this tower. Now, what separates Mundo from the rest of these strong side laning champs is Mundo does not care about tanking your opponent. Same reason as the early game, where you've got your passive to block CC, you can regen it back, but if you were to take a lot of damage, say you're playing a champion like Jax, and you walk up and ignore, maybe an Ornn, or, this example, a Clid, and you get chunked to half, That's it, you're half HP, you probably need a base. But Mundo, you never need to recall. The only time you should base on Mundo is when you have a full item, or when there's literally nothing else to do. Like your whole team is dead or off map or something like that, and you've got a couple K, you can base. But because you have no mana, and you have no, you're not going to be low HP because of your Warmogs, you only really need to base when you get a full item. So you can see now, I can tank the Recount W, proc my Heartsteel on the way out, chunk him with Q and auto as well. I'm not afraid to trade damage. Now they have 2 people answering me, and I'm not afraid to get chunked. I'm going to keep pressuring and making them respond, and the second they leave, I'm going to break the tail. But even if they stay, I'm probably still going to go for it, because my champion is so hard to deal with. So we can see now, I'm respecting a bit. I don't know where their whole team was. If I knew it was just Rakan and Jhin, I wouldn't have been this afraid. But now we can see straight back into side. I don't need a base right now, even though I have 1.1k. What am I going to buy? Maybe a giant spell or something like that. Useless. I only need to be basing for a full item. Or like I said, on a timer where you literally have nothing else to do, then it is okay to buy. So here, I'm playing for the tower yet again, ignoring this Jhin completely, not afraid to take any damage. And yeah, even if I was playing Jax here, I would have done the same thing. But I'd say more often than not, it's completely different. Where on Mundo, if let's say you're versus an Aatrox and you do quite well, pretty hard matchup, so that'd be quite good on you, or a Renekton, you can just tank their damage or any tank and get a half HP under tower. Maybe you do need an ulti if they pop ulti and all in you, but it's really hard to die. So here I base, TP back in. And the reason I based here is because I wanted to go bottom anyway, so I might as well spend my 2k. And then I just TP straight back to bot, same thing again. I broke top tier 2, going straight for bottom. And if a fight happens around Dragon, yeah, I can be a part of it, but I'm mainly here to pressure the side towers as hard as possible. Now, you're not always just going to completely ignore your team and play for side towers, of course, but in a game where you can, so a game where you do well, or you're in a matchup where they don't really have enough damage to all in you, especially if you're up against champions that take Grasp, or Fleet, or Phase, pretty much any champ that doesn't take Conqueror, their all-in is not going to be strong enough to stop you from taking tower. Now, there will be some exceptions, especially if you're behind, but you don't really need to be that afraid of champions that aren't really good in extended fights, because you can just ulti their burst worst case scenario, and even if you get chunked to 10% HP, you can just regen it back. So you can see playing really hard for side here, have no interest in, playing it safe or grouping up with my team, and they send 2 people to deal with me, but I'm unkillable. Alright, proc the Rakan W with my passive, and I'm just good to go. So you can see the way I'm playing and they send more people here, I think they send a 3, or maybe they just, to get my ulti down with Yasuo ulti. I pop ulti, I get my Heartsteel procs, and I'm out. Really hard to get punished inside when you're playing well on Mundo. And yeah, I'm pretty fed this game. But even in games that I played where I was, doing quite poorly, I'll show an example of that as well. You can still do the same thing, but especially in games where you're ahead, you should make it so they need to send 2 or 3 people to deal with you at all times. And then once you have that scenario, you can either stick around and still try to blow up the tower, or you can move and team fight with your team. It really depends on the game, but I do advise in games where you can ignore one person and break the tower, you play really heavily inside and make them send the majority of their team to stop you. Now for our next example, this game I'm playing up against an Alawi, and I do have a little bit of a lead in this game as well, not as big as last time, but again, my game plan is going to remain the same. I want to be creating as much pressure inside as possible, making them react, and if they do react, I either blow up tower in front of them, or maybe I rotate to a fight, but in a game where you can blow up tower in front of them, that is going to be the most pressuring thing you can do by far. So I fade away Q here as he TPs in. I didn't really want to get ulted under tower with just 2 minions. And now I'm just going to be looking to constantly pressure side. So I respected a little bit here because Warwick was nearby. And you can see I'm trying to do as much damage to Alawi as possible. And I'm not afraid to take damage in response. So now we just chunked each other. Relatively similar HP. I got her down a little bit lower, of course, because my HP is so high. But I'm not afraid to do that because I've got Warmogs now. So she has to base, but I don't because my champion has infinite sustain. So now, Warden to the jungle, just to make sure I don't get 3-manned, and I'm going to be going for this tower. Even if Alawi stayed and ulted me, I wouldn't care because yet again, I can just regen it all back, and I'm not interested in what's going on bottom. You can see even though I have TP, I'm not even looking, because no matter how good it looks bot, I'm not going to TP here, because I know the tier 2 is more valuable. So now, just ignore him, break the tower, get a chunk down, and now I'm rotating off. I want to be going bottom, and I don't really need to base here. I do have 2k gold, but I don't have a full item to buy, so I want to be pressuring more, and I saw Hikram was pushing mid, so I want to be pressuring the tower as well if I can. So we can see just how much damage this champion can do for towers, and if you can get Void Grubs on Mundo as well, the game is 10 times easier, but it is very hard to get the 6 grubs because your champion is very weak early game, so you shouldn't really expect your jungler to do so. So Ezreal arrives here, and I'm just completely ignoring his damage breaking tower in front of him. You can see how hard this champion can be to deal with in games where you're even or ahead. So now they collapse onto me, just pop ulti and run away. My passive will block Talon E, Taric E, sorry. So you can see the difference between Mundo and other split pushing champions, as you don't really want to be losing your resources on the majority of them. Now there are some exceptions like Tryndamere with this Hydra build as well, but if you're playing a champ like Jax and the same thing happens, you're either going to die or you're going to get chunks so low that you have to base. But I choose to recall now, because I have the exact amount for an item, and I'm TPing back. So you'll see something, I'm not walking to side and thinking, oh, I'll hold my TP in case my team needs me. In games where you can win through side, you should be TPing purely for tempo. So getting back to lane faster, so that you can, pressure as hard as you can. And I'm not afraid to take some damage here. Actually, I flashed away. I didn't have my ulti up. But you can see we're able to take down this Alawi. And now again, I'm going to be pressuring side. So my team chose to gank for me, good on them. If they didn't, I would have done the same thing again. Chunk the Alawi, get chunked myself, regen it back, and while she bases, then I can go for her tower. So you can see already in the span of maybe 3 minutes, I broke the top, mid, and bot tower. Now the mid tower one's going to be rare. You can't just go mid when their whole team's there. That's just an opportunity. But you mainly want to be trying to get down these two tier 2 towers on side, top and bottom, as fast as you can in games where you have a slight lead. Because now I'm at this point, I'm a 3-item Mundo, completely juiced, can pretty much 1v5 the game, based purely from how I played the mid game. Now I wanted to wrap up the mid game with one more example, because you're probably wondering, what do I do in a game where I'm not strong enough to hit the tower in front of them? So I've got an example here, where I'm playing up against an Aatrox, which is a pretty hard matchup for Mundo. It's a Conqueror champ, like we touched on before. If your opponent's got Conqueror, you do have to be a bit more wary. It doesn't mean you can never hit tower in front of them, but it is going to be a lot more difficult. So if you find yourself in the scenario where you can't just ignore your opponent and hit the tower, you kind of have two options where you still want to be pressuring side if you can. So here I can kind of get pushing, because if we trade HP, that's always going to benefit me, but I'm not strong enough to hit the tower in front of him. So I can either push him in and look for a 5v4 team fight with my team, or I can look to just keep him stuck under the tower, try to chunk him, and maybe make him base, and then punish the timer where he TPs away or when he recalls. So you can see, I'm really happy to trade HP with him here, because I want both of us to be low so I can just heal it back. And if he ever leaves, I will go for the tower, or if there's a good scenario where I can teamfight, I'll also go for that as well. But in this game, we have a Xerath and a Kog'Maw, they kind of need more time, so it's not going to be a good teamfight scenario. So he pops ulti and all into me. You can see he's a lot stronger than the last two opponents we just faced, but no matter what happens, you can always kind of pop ulti and get away, even if they flash on you like this guy did, and there's just no worry at all. I don't care about being low at all on this champion. I'm not afraid of dying here. I just gotta, get some dodging feet on, and eventually I can just walk backwards, heal with my Warmogs, and we're good to go. So we can see we chunked him to about half, we burnt his ulti and his flash, I guess he chose to burn it himself, and now I'm just going to regen back to full with my Warmogs. So he's trying to stop my Mogs, good on him. The reason I gave him my Mogs here was purely because my Bard was coming, by the way. I wanted to bait him in. If Bard wasn't looking for this play, I would have walked back a couple more steps, not touched this wave much, and then just regen back to full. But because Bard was coming, I baited him in a little bit, and we're able to play for the kill. So I'm not afraid of walking up here, because I've got my W to block his burst if I need to, and Bard's got some healing, and we're able to take him out, and again, play for tower, make them react. So if they make a mistake and die or TP away or base, then you can look to pressure this tower. But yeah, there will be games where you can't completely ignore them and break tower in front of them, like I'm doing now to this Rek'Sai. So if that's the case, you need to get a bit more creative. You can either waste their time, trade HP with them, or you can look for a team fight if you feel like your team has a high chance of winning one. Next up, we're going to be covering team fighting. Now, I'd say Mundo's not a very good team fighting champion. You've probably seen some games or maybe played some where you get really fed and you can just run them down. Like I'll show a B-roll of the screen now of me doing that. But generally, your champion's not the best team fighter. So how do you play team fights to get the most value out of your champion? That's going to heavily depend on the game state. Mundo's a champion where you don't really have a set identity in a team fight like you would on a champion like Darius, where you want to front to back, or an Olaf where you want to, dive the backline. Mundo, it really depends on the scenario. So if you're fit enough where you can just do this, of course it's very easy. But if you're not that strong and the game is relatively close, it really depends on the game state. So I'll show some examples, but it's really important to see your team comp, how well they're doing, and make a decision on how you want to play. If your team comp is a dive comp, so if maybe you have a Kai'Sa or a Vi, champs that want to go forward, a Rel, then you can just run down the backline with your team. But if you're not very fed, you can't do that by yourself, like in this example, so it's really important that you have dive buddies and follow up for that dive style. But if that's not the case, maybe your team is more front to backy, maybe you have an Azir mid, or a Hui, champs that want to sit back and chill, then you might need to play front to back. So on this example on my screen now, I have a Talia and a Hui. If I didn't get extremely fed and dominate my lane, then I probably would have just played front to back and facilitated their damage, because these champs can't run forward. But if they were, Xayah can't, Kai'Sa, champs that can go forward, a Yone mid, of course I would do the same thing even if I was 0-5 in the game, because that's how we're going to get the most value out of our team comp. Now for our first example, it's a game where I want to be playing front to back. And the reasoning for that, I can't really win through side here, so I can't just go top and pressure in front of Gwen, one of the hardest matchups for Mundo. Can't really break tower in front of her whatsoever, or even get push. So I want to be playing front to back because of my team comp. I've got a Jhin, I've got Karthus, Bard, and Corki. All four of these champions want to be just hitting front and chilling. Like, you could argue Corki can go forward at times, but me and him can't really do everything by ourselves, and he'll just get one shot if he valks forward. So I want to be playing front to back and creating as much space as possible for my team. Now, I do make some mistakes in this team fight. We're going to review it together, but you can see we're off to a good start. I'm approaching from the side instead of the front just because I created some sort of pressure before the dragon and made Gwen respond, so she's going to be late to this fight. And here I should have held my Q, anticipating the Jinx flash, and I walked forward a little bit too far here. So I got kind of lost in the sauce of just diving backline as my default on Mundo in games where you get fed. But here I realized halfway through, like, they have Jinx Brawl. I'm not going to be running them down, and my teammates can't follow me up. So I kite back and start to create space. So here, I bash the Ahri down, and the reason I'm not just holding my ground and fighting them is I don't want to be tanking Gwen and her W and Jinx over the wall for no reason, so I'm kiting back a bit. Now, here's the biggest mistake of the fight for me. I should have clicked forward now. As soon as Karthus died and dropped this passive here, it's really hard for the opponents to run forward, and the Gwen W also expired, so I should have ran towards them now and created more space for my team. So I'm a couple seconds late, I click, 2 steps here, and then I go back. So that was my big mistake from this team fight, and it looks like a little thing, but it does add up. If I clicked forward 2 seconds earlier, then my Jhin and Corki could have done so as well, and we might have been able to pick up an extra kill. So your main goal in these games, where your backline is doing well, or even in general when you can't dive the backline yourself, you want to be creating as much space for your team as possible, and kind of facilitating their damage. So it's good to watch your backline and see what they're doing, making sure if you're tanking damage, they can do damage in response, so you're not just getting chunked for free. Now in this game I've got here, I wanted to showcase a pretty over-the-top example of creating space for your team. Because that term is thrown around quite a lot, so I want to showcase very clearly what creating space for your team is. And it pretty much is allowing your team the ability to walk forward and get their abilities or their auto attacks down and, get the most out of their champion. So here I rotate down, push top, make them respond, and help my team get this free kill. And this is what I mean by over the top. Here I'm walking forward really hard, even taking the tower, so my Lulu and my Zeri can walk forward as well. So we get a little bit of a chunk onto Nasus, and the reason why it doesn't matter at all is because I have wall mogs. You can see I even pinged it. It's fine, guys, I've got mogs, but it's pretty stupid. The payoff is pretty small, and I wanted my Zeri to hit tower a little bit, but without voice comps, that's pretty impossible. So you can see it's a little bit of an over-the-top example. So here again, we're going to be, I know my team wants to break the tower, I know Zeri wants to auto-attack, so I'm going to be running completely forward and trying to create as much space as possible. So here, cutting back a little bit because my Zeri walked off to the side. I don't really want to be creating space for Lulu, she's useless, so here I just let her die. Not my problem that she walked up too far, but I want to be creating space for Zeri and Aurelion Sol. My main damage dealers are all I really care about. So now, he got a really good W down and, to slow them now. So I'm going to be creating as much space as possible. So running them down here, just walking really far forward, even though I know I can't kill this guy by myself, I want to do a little bit of damage, but I'm walking far forward so that my Zeri can walk far. If I'm here, Zeri can't walk here, of course, right? So you need to be that barrier, and the more you push forward, the more your AD carry can do so. So here you can see I walk really far forward. I even stop here so he doesn't take a tower shot. Dodge the Jhin W, of course I'm not going to get hit by skill shots if I don't need to. And now my ASO is stuck in the Q animation, so I blocked the Jhin ulti as well. So, and then I walk off to the side here. So Zeri goes a little bit deep. I can't really jump over walls like that. Maybe I could have flashed, but I don't have ulti. So you can see this was an example of me really over the top creating space, but it did work out. The Zeri went a bit crazy, but because I walked so far forward, the Zeri and Asa were also able to walk very far forward. So that's kind of what it means to create space. I don't recommend just randomly taking towers for no reason like I did here, of course, but it's something you definitely can do on Mundo because you're going to regen that HP back anyway. One more example here, and this guy is probably the best Mundo player in the world that I've seen. He's over 1000 LP Korean Challenger playing only Dr. Mundo, which is very hard on the Korean server because Mundo is so weak early, and there's a lot of skirmishing and team fighting at early points of the game. So we can see he TP's in, he's got his Warmogs and his Ruby, so he's got his Spike, he's not afraid to tank damage, and the way he played this team fight was quite nice. So he's running down this Lilia, bashing her down. You'll notice he's not using his ulti right now. He's not using his ulti when he's in a fight, he's not using it for movement speed, he uses it for a very specific purpose. surface, so you want to be using your ulti when you're as low HP as possible. You get a lot more value from it, of course, but also when you're low, it kind of baits them in. He baited this Cassio and this Lilia to use the majority of their damage on him, and then he just pops ulti, gets the brunt of it back, and regens the majority of their damage. Or if he popped ulti and he's like full HP, regening, they're probably not going to hit him. They're going to use their damage on other targets. And in this fight, it probably wouldn't have mattered as much, but it was still really nice to see him using ulti when he's as low as possible without, any risk of dying, and get a lot of value from that spell. And also with his W here, he uses it when Trinity spins in, regens a bit of damage from that W. So really nice team fighting overall. Now, Mundo's spells are pretty simple to use, but it means you need to use them very well. So ulti, if you can use as low as possible without dying, that is easier said than done. Sometimes you might hold it too long and get bursted, especially if you get ignited. But you can see here they have no healing cut, the Cassio top and their Lilia, so he knows he can hold it for as long as possible and pop it after tanking the majority of their damage. Next up, we have Mundo's identity and the mindset you should have when playing this champion. And a pretty key part of Mundo's identity is just the fact that you're a very weak early game champion, but you spike extremely hard on your one item. So more specifically, Warmogs with a Ruby, you become one of the strongest champions in that game if you're not already behind. So if you can get to that point without getting behind, staying even, you're going to do great. So you don't want to be playing Mundo like you're playing a Jax or a Nixon, where you're trying to force early kills in lane and, trade, make the lane very volatile. You want to keep the lane pretty standard, but that doesn't mean you want to be playing like a complete pussy onto Warmogs, because your opponent's always going to be making mistakes, or the matchup might not even be that hard. So if your opponent's making errors, over forcing onto you, which is very common when you're playing Mundo, or just not using wave to block Q, stuff like that, you always want to be watching your opponent closely and trying to punish them with Qs or E's through the wave, and if they get low enough, you might even be able to round them down with ulti for a solo kill, because your opponent's always going to make mistakes. So you still want to be playing Mundo as a baseline, trying to get to Warmog's Ruby without getting behind, but if you see your opponent is making mistakes, you definitely want to capitalize and punish them, but you just don't want to be hitting into the game trying to shit on your opponent as hard as possible before Warmogs, because more often than not, that's going to lead to you getting behind before you get to that spike. Now, after you do hit that spike, Mundo becomes one of the most oppressive side laners to play against, because he has infinite sustain, and you have a lot of agency to pressure the opponent's tower in front of them, where not a lot of split pushes can do that unless they won their lane very hard. So even if you went even in lane as Mundo, you have pretty good CS, you have Warmogs and Ruby. If you verse a lot of champions, especially other tanks or tanky bruisers that don't do a lot of damage, you can start to tank them and break the tower in front of them, because even if you get chunked or all-in, you can just pop your ulti and run away and regen that HP back with your Warmogs. Get that fadeaway Q auto as you run away, chunk the opponent as well. It's always going to benefit you, but you can slowly chip away at that tower every time you have your demolish up. Or maybe in some cases, especially if you have Void Grubs, you can break the whole tower and ignore them, but you have so much agency in side lane to exploit the game if you're even or ahead, so you want to be utilizing that as much as you can. Don't default to just getting your items, grouping up with your team at Dragon and standing in front of your 0-4 Gen or something like that. Don't just default to team fighting on this champ. Your team fighting is not actually that good, even though you're a tank, because your kit is not really built for team fighting. You want to be exploiting the game through side as you can, and trying to create those advantages every game that you play. Now, although your kit's not the most useful in teamfights compared to other tanks like Ornn or champs like Cassante, you're still very good at creating space because your champion is so fast, so it's very easy for you to walk up, create that space for your backline, and then move back if you need to. So you want to be sort of watching your backline damage threats and having them move up with you. In games where you're not just strong enough to run them over, of course that's very easy to do. If you're fed, just run down the backline, bash them down with your ulti, very easy. But in games where you're not that strong, you want to be paying close attention to your backline threat, your damage threat, and giving them the space needed to get their damage down. Now, we did touch on it a little bit already, but the mindset you want to be having on Mundo is you are a selfish champ, so you want to be getting yourself as strong as possible. I see a lot of Mundos, especially below plat, they treat Mundo like just a tank, where you facilitate your team, where they get their Warmogs, they group up, they run around on 90 or 100 CS for the whole game, and just try to get their team to do well. Now, these players often have a 50 or below 50% win rate, because in games where your team is winning, of course you're going to win that way, but in games that are very close or games where you're losing, you're not going to be the difference maker in that game, where if you get really strong through side, do okay in your lane, blow up tower in front of them, pressure the tier 2, you're going to get yourself fed, especially if you can get those tier 2 towers down, you can get very strong, very over leveled, over itemed, and then become that beast where you just run them down in team fights and completely 1v5, but you need to get yourself a lot of gold to get to that point, and the best way to do that on this champion, who doesn't really have the most kill threat, is to win through side and pressure towers as hard as you can. Next up, we have a full game review where I'm going to be talking you through exactly what I'm thinking throughout this entire game. Now, in this matchup, I'm playing Mundo up against Pantheon. This lane is very hard early game. It gets a lot better for you as the game goes on, but I put this as a Pantheon favored matchup because he has a lot of agency. He can get push, he can poke you down with his Q and make the wave come back to him and kill you with Ignite. So I'd say the 1 to 5 is very difficult, but if you can get to, Giant Spout base or something like that, you're going to be fine. So I'm going to showcase something pretty important. If your opponent is ever late to lane, regardless of matchup for whatever reason, you need to be punishing. So because the Pantheon invaded my Shaco, I was queuing him on the way back to lane, and you can see I'm making him walk through 3 Qs on the way back, and now he's unable to force prior in this matchup because he's so low. Now, to be honest, if he was, a bit more aggressive, if I was the Pantheon, I still would have forced prior here by queuing the Mundo in the wave the whole time, but he felt very pressured because he tanked a lot of cleavers, so I saw an opportunity where I could have got pushed myself. So I got level 2, run him down. Right now I'm fine to trade a bit of HP, auto E, walk a bit more for Q, and looking back at this trade, I should have just taken the auto E and ran away, not greeted for that cleaver, but it's fine. I'm going to get pushed, which means I can base whenever I want, and here I'm just testing the limits of my champion. I have flash auto EQ, and it's something I definitely recommend doing, not for the flash auto EQ part, but testing the limits of a champion that you're learning, where there, even if my Q hit, he would have lived on 20 HP, so I know that for next time, not worth going for that type of flash there. But I'm slowly pushing my wave in. I'm probably going to crash wave 4 instead of wave 3, because it's nicely in the center of the lane here. So there's no need for me to rush into it. I've got a ward down as well. They have a Nico jungle, not the scariest ganker in the game, especially if I have my passive up. So we can see here, pushing this wave in, Mr. CS, unlucky, and I'm just going to be crashing this wave and basing. Mundo's pretty bad at tower diving, so even though this guy's quite low, he's going to have Pantheon E in a second, so I'm pretty worried to go for a dive here, and there's a bit of a jungle gap. My Shaco's bottom, Nico's top, so Nico could be in this bush, right around here, so I'm a bit worried to dive him, so I'm just going to base and TP back. Now, generally on Mundo, I'd actually advise against TPing back, where if you've ever heard my coaching, I strongly recommend TPing back in lots of matchups where you can play for kills. But on Mundo, I would say walking back is better, more often than not, because you're very weak. You're not going to kill somebody on the bounce back level 4 very often, but here I've got an opportunity to do so that's why I TP. If nothing happens here, and you can see I ward for it because I know I'm going to be playing aggressive, if the wave comes back and it's purely 1v1, I can kill this guy. He has no flash as well, but of course the jungler's going to come ruin our good time, and here he is. So I straight away start fighting this Pantheon down. I know he's got no flash, but I know he has E, so I'm clicking back now, and I'm going to have to play this one out. So big part about Mundo is you need to have good movement, and good on this Nico for holding her E. You can see I'm trying really hard to dodge her E, and she held it the whole time. So really smart by her, but I was able to W the E damage anyway, and I was able to outplay this a little bit. I think I still die in the end, but they're both 1 HP, they're wasting time. I think I killed this guy with a cleaver, so I was able to play and burn the Nico flash as well, so I was able to play this out pretty well. So this is going to be pretty rare that you can pressure this hard on Mundo, but again, like we talked about on the laning section, don't be afraid to take these opportunities if your opponent makes a mistake. The only reason I was able to solo kill and waste jungle's time and flash like this is because the Pantheon was late to lane. Now, in lower elo bracketed games, they might be late to lane for different reasons. Maybe they're hot tabbed on Insta or something, or watching a video, or maybe they're leashing, right? Where in higher ranked games they never leash, but this guy chose to do something aggressive and attack because he was up against a Mundo Shaco, pretty weak level 1 champs, and I was able to punish him for that. So now from this point in the lane, I've gained a pretty sizable advantage, so I'm going to be playing for my Demolished Kingdom. I want to be stacking up this wave as big as I can and blowing up the tower in front of Pantheon because he died with the wave bouncing back to me, so now I have a pretty sizable XP advantage. I'm not up 2 levels, but maybe 1 level and a little bit, so I want to be stacking the biggest wave I can and blowing up his tower. Now, another factor to keep in mind, not just how ahead you are, but really how your opponent is playing. Even if this Pantheon was a level 5 right now, about to tick 6, I would still go for this because this guy's playing so passive. He's playing really respectful, letting me do whatever I want, so I'm going to be trying to blow up his tower. And you'll verse a lot of players like that in lower elo bracketed games, that they just sort of chill under tower and don't trade, so you really want to be blowing up the tower if that's the case. You can see here, hit my Q, proc my approach velocity, get the Nikes on, and blow up the tower. So he stuns onto me, my passive blocks it, and if somehow he did more damage to me, maybe he's a bit stronger, worst case I can pop my ulti and run out of there, and I'm definitely okay with that type of trade. So I'll take the fruit. Hopefully my Shaco plays for Void Grubs here, but most likely not. If I remember correctly, he didn't really do much this game, so I'm going to be playing more so for my matchup. So I let the wave come back in here. I don't have Demolish, so it's hard to play for demolishing the tower, and Nico is topside. I'm pretty sure I felt that in the game. I'm pretty scared of her coming in for a gank, especially because I have no flash and I'm half HP. So here, I'm trying to kind of freeze my way for a little bit until I feel like the Void Grub sequence is done and Nico goes back to bottom, and then I'm going to be playing to blow up the tower again. Because if I try to proc demolish now, probably Nico would just appear in the lane and kill me. So you can see I checked all the bushes, tried to stop his recall, keep him here, and there's the Nico minion, very suspicious, and my passive just blocks her E, and I'm able to run it out. So pretty much wasted my ulti there looking back. That was a small mistake. I should have just tanked his E with my passive and been fine, but got a little bit freaked out by that really suspicious minion running in. So here, he crashed the wave, and I'm going to be looking to try get myself a recall, because when you're at this type of point where you're low HP with no ulti, it becomes very difficult for you to kind of do anything. I can't proc demolish. I'm scared of trading. He might just W ignite me and kill me. That's why I'm warding the bush there, but I do want to be basing. And I kind of felt like he recalled himself because he was trying to before. When I stopped his base, I think he might have cried for Nico to help him base. So I just felt like he recalled, so I'm basing. But if I was against somebody more aggressive than this Pantheon, so if this game was in Korean solo queue, probably he'd be hiding in here. So I would have just based on that awkward wave and it would have sucked a little bit. But there are going to be a lot of scenarios where you do have to base on a shitty wave on Mundo, because that's just how weak your champion is early. But because I knew this Pantheon, well, not new, but pretty confident he would base early, I was able to greed for that wave. So here you can see I got all the HP I can. And I did get the Wing Moon Plate because I couldn't buy another ruby. I've got all the rubies I need, so now it is okay to do so. So he got a plate because my base was a bit awkward and his jungler helped him get a good tempo recall. But now again, let's stack the biggest wave we can and play for Demolish. So you don't always need to stack 2 waves together. You'll see why I'm hard pushing this one. If it's a cannon wave, your cannon is going to do enough damage to him if he tries to block the wave that you can proc demolish without stacking 2. So that's exactly why I one-shot this wave, and the faster I can get my demolish down, the faster I'll get my next one up. So I didn't really want to stack this wave with a second one because I didn't really need to. So here you can see I walk past him, make him W onto me, and yeah, I take a bit of damage. He takes damage in response, but I'm okay with that because I've got, Mundo ulti and his champ doesn't have any sustain. Now here at this grub fight, I do make a bit of a mistake where I really wanted grubs, of course, because they're so good on Mundo, but it's just not realistic. My Shaco is so weak here, level 6 half HP Shaco, just level 7 Nico, you see, he just gets obliterated. So I should have played this a bit slower. I shouldn't have popped ulti straight away. I should have tried to Q Nico and circle around kind of like a shark, holding my ulti and my W for a better opportunity, and given time for my Braum and my Ari to join. But here my Shaco is just useless, gets one shot, and I get chunked and lose my flash. So in this type of scenario, it's going to be pretty common that you don't win 2v2 at the grub fight on Mundo. This time it was mainly because my jungler was weak, but a lot of games it's going to be because you're weak, because you're playing Mundo. So you need to give time for your strong teammates to join if they're on the way, or if they're not coming, you got to be willing to give the grub. So there, if my Braum wasn't on the way, and Ari wasn't coming too, I could have just given grubs and gone back to top. But if I did want to fight it, which I do, I need to give them time and just hold my spells, stay high HP, and be ready. But it worked out well in the end, so it's okay. And here I'm just greeting a little bit of extra farm for my Warmogs. And even though it won't spike really hard, because I won't have my Ruby as well, I still want to greed for it because it is a bit of a better buy than basing now and buying Crystalline Bracer or something weak along those lines. I'll go base here, and now that I've got my Warmogs, even though I don't have Ruby on, I'm going to be playing extremely aggressive and trying to blow up this tower. So I'll speed up the game a little bit, and here we can see TPing in with Warmogs, and straight away, tower destruction time, circling around, getting my procs down, and we do have 3 grubs already, which is a really good start. If we can get all 6, I'm going to be in a great spot to carry this game. So here you can see Warmogs not activating, we just don't have the HP needed, but I still feel strong enough to pressure this Pantheon, so I'm not too worried. So quick little trade there with W, auto W, W auto proc grasp, W2, get that burst down and the extra healing. And now I'm going to be trying to stack a wave and go for the Demolish proc again. Now, even though he has healing cut, I'm still confident I can out-sustain his damage with my ulti. So I'm going to be going for a tower proc on this cannon minion. So you can see here, I'm trying to get my cannon low, his cannon low, so that I can knock it through the wave. And also if he W's onto me and I fight him back, I don't want that cannon to sort of bash me down. So here you can see I pop ulti and Q him and walk in with the approach velocity and pick up my passive and just playing to blow up the tower. So really annoying playstyle to play against, but it's something you really need to master on Mundo, kind of towing that line between playing extremely aggressive and tanking damage and blowing up tower without dying. And the best way to learn your limits is just from experience. On my early Mundo games, I did die a few times doing this exact thing, but I sort of learned how much damage I can do, how much I can take, and blow up the tower without any risk of dying. So I base here for my Ruby to get my proc as well. I couldn't go for the tower on that timer, so you can see the reason I based here pretty obvious I'm pretty low, but I can't play for the Demolish Proc in front of him. I have no ulti, so it's a pretty good time to base. So I base, come back, and now I'm just the best champion the entire game. Now that I've got my Warmogs activated, I can do 10 damage to him and take 1,000 if I want to. I'll just regen it, doesn't matter whatsoever. So I'm going to be playing like it. I'm going to play extremely aggressive and blow up his tower. And you can see he's running away. I'm trying to catch up to him and play for that kill. Don't think I kill him here. Yeah, I just let him get away, that's fine. And now I'm going to be playing the exact same thing for the tier 2 tower. I'm pretty sure here, if I remember correctly, I held my Demolish on purpose, where if the tower you're killing is quite low, the tier 1, it's important to hold your Demolish if you can, so that you don't have to wait for that cooldown when you're pressuring the tier 2. Because from the enemy team's point of view, right now you're still in lane, right? From this point here. So there's no urgency for them to answer you. So if you just break this tower and you one-shot this wave, and on this next wave, you're already proccing Demolish on tier 2, there's so much pressure, and they probably didn't have time to react to it, you know, if they were farming Krugs or looking for a gank bot or something like that. So it's definitely a little trick you can do where you hold on to your Demolish. But pretty smart of the Nico here to disguise herself as Pantheon, but I just do a lot of damage now, so I'm not too worried. And now they've got 2 people answering me, and it's something we talked about in the identity section. One of the most pressuring things you can do in the game, in League's top lane, is be in a scenario where they need 2 people to answer you, and that's exactly what I'm in now. They even need to send 3, so it's really hard for them to play this type of game. And if my team collapses here like they do, we're able to win the skirmish. So just really good scenario to be in. Even if my team didn't answer and respond very well, they could make a bot play, they could pressure mid tower. You give your team so much space to play if you make 2 or more people answer you. So it's definitely the most pressuring thing you can do. Even though I'm really fit in this game, you know, maybe I could group in team fight just as an example. I don't want to because it's not as pressuring for me to group in a team fight and be strong than it is for me to bash down the side and make them send their whole team to stop me, of course. So here, I'm going to be still playing for tier 2. I have a lot of gold, but I want to break this tier 2 before I leave, because I want to be going bottom after and playing for that bot tier 2, so I don't want to leave this tower still standing. And I don't have ulti, so I have to play a bit safe, but you can see I have really good vision here. If I didn't have these wards down, I would base and buy Heartsteel and not go for the tower, but because I feel very confident, I'm going to go for it right now. Auto E, pop the Q onto him and run away, and now I'm going to base, pick up my Heartsteel, and do the same thing all over again to bottom. So here you're going to see shortly, I TP bottom for tempo. I actually TP for a play as well. I see the Lux overextended, but even if she wasn't there, I would have TP'd. You don't want to be walking to side, taking 30 seconds and hoping, oh, if my team gets caught, I'll TP in a game where you can pressure side this hard. That's not needed. Even if my team gets caught out mid, I do not care whatsoever, because if I can break this tower and the tier 2 bot, I'm going to be strong enough to completely 1v9 the game. Now, I would care a little bit more if Baron was up, because if they got ace mid here and we lose Baron, then I can't really carry this game. But pre-20 minutes, you shouldn't really worry that much about your team getting caught out in games where you can pressure side, especially 1v1 in front of your opponent. Exactly like I'm doing here. I make them mid TP in, so much pressure and so hard for them to deal with. So Dragon's coming up, and I am on the Dragon side, so I'm not going to never team fight. I would say, to be honest, I very rarely did team fight on the Mundo journey, because if you do well in lane, you can exploit the game through side, but I would team fight if it looked good, right? If they were squaring up for this Dragon fight and I felt like we can win, I definitely would, but here I just don't need to, because I'm making so much progress inside that that's the way I'm going to be winning. So here they send Seraphine, Pantheon, their whole team has to answer me, and I'm just going to hold this pressure, and eventually they have to leave. They can't send 3 people to hold me the entire game. Eventually my team is going to pressure something on the other side, and they're not going to be able to do so. So you can see I am kind of looking for a team fight here, because I'm playing on the Dragon side. And you've probably seen from a lot of my videos, I do kind of say quite often, play on the opposite side of the next spawning objective. Now that is still good as a general rule to create pressure. Like here, if I was playing top, there would be creating a lot of pressure so that I could kind of create a 5v4 team fight. But here I felt so strong that I just wanted to speed up the game and explode bottom or carry this fight if needed. But in a game where maybe my team was doing worse, and I felt like there was no chance we could have won a team fight, I probably would have gone top here and just tried to pull them away from Dragon, and if nobody answered me, play for that tier 3. But because I felt very confident I could win side and win a team fight, as you'll see shortly, I went to, straight to the bot lane, and played as aggressive as possible. Now here we can see, I'll slow down the fight, I play front to back, holding on my ulti a little bit, pop it now because I got a little bit scared of the ignite. That was a bit bad of me, I should have held it a little bit longer, and now I'm just going to run them down. So proc the Heartsteel on everyone I can, flash after kill the Caitlyn. So pretty straightforward. When you're strong on Mundo, team fighting becomes very easy. You can just run them down. But you see here, if I held my ulti, it would have been a bit nicer for the chase, but I'm going to get it regardless because approach velocity is such a good rune on this champ. So we don't miss cleavers here. You can see able to pick up this kill, and I'm probably going to base and pick up my next item as I have enough. So here, if I had, let's say, 2k gold, I wouldn't have based here because I don't have enough for Hull Breaker, but because I can sell D-Shield for it, I'm going to do that, and now I'm going to be able to completely end the game by myself in front of them unless they send their whole team to stop me. So I'll fast forward a little bit. From this point in the game, I'm going to be doing the exact same thing, trying to create as much pressure bottom as possible, and if they only send one person to stop me, I'm going to be blowing up the tower in front of them because I'm so strong at this point. And Shaco's even hovering me, makes me feel a bit more confident. So even though I don't have ulti, I walk up here because Shaco's around, and you can see with Hull Breaker and Grubs and Demolish, you just obliterate the tower in seconds, and we're able to take down this Pantheon as well. So I'm not afraid to take damage at all, I'm just going to heal that back. Infinite sustain inside is just so hard to deal with, because one of the, I'd say, most annoying parts about playing a split pushing champion is when you need to base, if your team gets caught on that timer when you recall and you're not pressuring, you're not going to be able to get anything. So every time you base on a split pusher, you have to be kind of willing to throw your team to the wind. You can be nice and backping them, but it's kind of out of your control if they die or not. Where if they die when you are pressuring, you can get a lot. So for example here, if my team died, I'd get the TF3. So it's completely fine. So on Mundo, the reason it's so nice is because you never have to base unless you have a full item, which means you can maintain pressure for a lot longer than a champion with mana, like an Olaf or a Jax or something like that, or yeah, or a champ like Fiora. Even though they're great inside, they do have timings when they have to base because of resources, where Mundo doesn't run into that problem, which means your pressure is more consistent. Now, not to go off topic here, I created a lot of pressure bottom and made 2 people react. So here we go, I'm going to be TPing into Baron and forcing it. So really good here, I noticed they have 2 people answering me bot, so which means we can force a Baron fight 5v3, and both of the people they sent to me don't have TP, of course it's their bot lane, so I can pressure Baron. But if they just sent the Pantheon, I would have blown up the tower in front of them, which is why they sent the 2. So really easily able to get Baron. So even though you are strong inside, and I probably could have pressured that for a little bit longer if I wanted to, Baron is still probably one of the most pressuring things you can take. So TPing in and just forcing Baron when you can, after you create that side lane pressure, is still a great play you can make on Mundo. So here, really easy, you can just run this guy down, and Mundo feels quite good with Braum. Having your Q combination with Braum passive, really easy to get kills. And like we kind of talked about in the drafting section, first champs like Lux and champs like Seraphine, these immobile mages that rely on CC, your champ gets so much value because they just don't have the consistent damage needed to kill you, and their only peel tool is blocked by your passive. So here, you know, you even tank the entire Lux combo, doesn't really do anything, even though I don't have MR. So great game to play Mundo in 100%, and now I'm just clicking back a little bit, regenning up with Warmogs, and then I'm going to be going back forward and creating space, unless my team wants a base. Okay, if they want a base here, that's fine, I'll recall with them. Even though I don't have a full item, we talked about it a little bit, I said you should only recall in timers where you have a full item, or when there's nothing to do. I can't pressure this top lane by myself with no ulti and my whole team in base, so I've got nothing to do. So basing here, coming onto the map at the same time as them, is going to be more valuable than me just staying top and killing a wave and hiding in that bush. So now, last sequence of the game, heading onto the map, the reason I picked up an Abyssal Mask is just because I'm very confident we can end on this push, so it was a cheap item that I could have bought in one shot instead of buying components. I'd never buy an Abyssal just for Ahri. Maybe if I had AP jungle mid, it'd be good, but generally you don't want to be building this item unless you can afford it in one go. This is just a nice cheap pickup. Most of the time Spirit Visage is going to be better. So here, I just completely tanked the tower to blow it up. Don't want to lose my minion, and I can just regen this back with Warmog. So again, pretty easy at this point. Once you get fit on Mundo, the game's very easy. You can just run them down, as you'll see shortly. I'll tank the towers even. But getting to this point is the hard part. So hopefully this helps you see that the Pantheon being late to lane, of course started off my snowball, but that's not the reason why I was able to get so fed. I got fed because I knew exactly what to do in the mid game. I blew up all the tier 2 towers, and I got fed in that way. I didn't really get that fed from kills. I do have a few now, especially farming them in their base, but I got very fed from playing very proactive inside, making them respond, blowing up the towers in front of them, and using that gold to just be an item or item and a half above the enemy team, to the point where I can just completely tank them like this, and there's nothing they can do about it. Next up, we're going to be going through the drafting to help you gain a better understanding of the best and worst scenarios to play this champion. So I'm going to be starting with our own team, but I do want to preface this by saying the champions on your own team on Mundo doesn't actually really matter. I'd say Mundo's pretty good with most champs in the game. I'll still go through the optimizations you can make, but the enemy team is the most important. You really want to see the enemy team comp before you pick Mundo. Unless you're a Mundo only player, that's fine as well, but this section doesn't really matter for you that much if you're only playing Mundo, but the enemy team is way more important than what's on your team. But if you do want to know what's good on your team, we'll go through it. As for your jungle, it's going to be champions that are in 2 categories. carries. I'd say champions with high DPS, so backline threats like Graves or Kindred, you can just be a frontline for them, or champions that are also dive buddies. Now, I will say it is a little bit nicer to have a full clearing jungler on your team, which I never thought I would say, but on champions like Mundo, where you don't really want to be doing anything levels 1 to 3 anyway, and not making it volatile, it's good just to have your jungler farming, because if your Lee Sin pass up, 3 camps with red buff, and you're just 90% HP Mundo level 2, just doing nothing, not really going to be able to snowball that Lee Sin, and if the enemy jungler is a farm jungler, then he's going to be more favored in that type of game. So either champs that go in, or champs that can stand behind you and do a lot of DPS are great. For mid's going to be the same thing. You could play with a champ like Aurora, feels really good. High damage and dive buddy as well. Or a champ like Hui or Azir, also pretty good. The same with AD carry. We'll just build our dive comp for this example. But again, we could have like a Hui and a Kog'Maw or a Phelios or something with a Graves jungle, stuff like that. It's also fine. But a dive comp is also good. So for support, champs like Rel, champs like Alistair, they can start the fight. Because although Mundo is pretty good at running forward, you're not really engaged. You're not going to engage with a cleaver if your opponent's playing properly, and you're not 5-0. So having somebody else like the Hecarim or the Aurora ulti or something to be thrown out, or the Rel, is going to feel very good for getting those fights started. But again, if you have a strong backline threat, then you can also just play more of that front-to-back style, and that's also okay. And as for the champions you're bad with, what you really don't want to be seeing on your team, for jungle, it's going to be pretty CC reliant champs. You don't want to play Mundo with like a Nidalee or a Talia or a champ like that relies on stun into flick combo, or a champ like Elise who wants to get a lot of work done early. It doesn't feel very good for them, and it doesn't feel good for you either. Now for mid, it's going to be assassin champs. They want to be playing inside. So champs like Zed and Kiana, it's not terrible. Like I wouldn't avoid playing Mundo if it's a good Mundo game just because my mid's playing that. It's just not as good as the alternatives. And as for bot, it's going to be champions that do very low damage. So mage AD carries would feel the worst probably. Champs like Seraphine and Ziggs, or a Jhin even. Maybe not this patch, Jin's quite strong. But generally these low damage AD carries feel quite bad with Mundo. You'd much rather a high damage one or a dive buddy that can go in with you. Now as for support, you really want to avoid playing it with enchanters that are very weak early. So although it does feel quite nice late game if you get Mundo Yumi, something like that, it's really hard for your team to not get completely shit on in 10 minutes if you have Mundo top and a hyper scaling, really weak early game bot like a Yumi. Even if this wasn't a Seraphine, let's just swap it out for like a Jhin. It's really hard for your jungle and mid to play this game because the enemy support jungle can completely run the map and your jungler doesn't have any options to really gank. Moving on to the most important part of this section by far, and that is the enemy team. The champions you do want to be seeing on the enemy team is what's going to let you know if it's going to be a good Mundo game or not. And as for top, it's going to be matchups where the lane is not that difficult, and you have a lot of room to blow up the tower in front of them. So champs like Malphite, champs like Cho'Gath, where Cho'Gath Q you can block with passive, Mundo Malphite ulti you block with it. Really easy to completely ignore these champions and start to blow up the tower, even as early as minute 5 once you have your giant spell. So as for the jungle, it's going to be skill shot reliant champions. Champs like Karthus, it's really good if you can verse AP top jungle, because you're just going to regen a lot of their burst down, and once you have Spirit Visage, you'll be unkillable. So champs like Karthus, but even champs like Lee Sin, who rely on their kick to get a kill, and they rely on hitting their Q skill shot when you're so fast, really hard to get a lot of value on those champs against you. But I would prefer to verse an AP skill shot reliant champ like Karthus, because the early game is very easy, except for that example where I showed before, where I completely ran it. Now as for mid, it's going to be champions that are very skill shot reliant, more so artillery mages, so champs like Lux, champs like Xerath, they're kind of burst mages from far away, but they rely on their own CC to peel, where if you run at a Lux, she's going to throw a Q, your passive blocks that, and then her burst isn't really going to do much to you. You can block that with W or ulti, and then you can just completely run them down. It feels a lot easier to verse these champs than sustained damage champs, which we'll go over later, like Cassiopeia, but these champs are the main point that you want to see, from top and mid, I'd say, because it makes your job very easy if top and mid can't answer you inside. And as for AD carry, same as before, it's going to be low damage champs. And in competitive for Mundo, I'd say this is the scenario where Mundo is best, when you verse major AD carries. So if you remember a few years ago, when AD carry was really weak before Freak stood in, they had champs like Swain and even some Mordekaiser AD carry. They pretty much didn't play marksman bot. That's when Mundo became very powerful, because you could just build Visage and they don't have enough sustained damage to kill you, so you can just tank all of their team's damage with your ulti and Spirit Visage. So that's still going to be true even to this day. If you see champs like Karthus AD carry, Seraphine or Ziggs, that should be one of the biggest indicators that Mundo is going to be a great pick this game. And as for support, doesn't actually matter. I'd say, he's fine into anything. Champs that rely on one CC ability, is a little bit better for you. So champs that can't really, peel you permanently, like a Braum that has quite a lot of CC. If you play it up against champions like Yumi or Sona, where they're quite weak early and they have 1 CC, well, Yumi doesn't really have any, but Sona ulti, it's going to be fine for you to run them down. Where if you verse another champ like a Braum or a Leona, they have so much CC, it's going to be a lot harder for you. And as for the champions you don't want to see on the enemy team no matter what, for top it's going to be in that category of they win lane against you and they outscale you inside in team fights as well. So champs like Gwen are really difficult, even champs like Fiora, even though she doesn't really outscale you in team fights until later on. She wins lane, she wins side, really hard for you to have a lot of options in this type of matchup. Now I would say Gwen is a lot harder than Fiora, but it's also going to be a difficult matchup. Now as for jungle, champions with percentage HP burn, so champs like Lilia, champs like Brand, who build Leandri's torch, they just burn you down. It's really hard for you to do your normal build. The Warmog's hard steal into them because you're going to get completely shredded as you're just building HP. And if you do go Visage second, you're not going to be as strong in that game, even though you probably need to do so. Now, as for mid, very similar champs with percentage HP, but also champs that are very hard to run into. So champs like Asol can actually be really hard to play against, and even champs like Yone, even though it's not that hard to run into them, they can build Bork and just shred you down and beat you in side lane. So maybe you're up against like a Malphite top, you win against him, but they just send the Bork Yone who one lane up against you. He's going to really ruin your fun time. And as for AD carry, the hardest by far is definitely Kog'Maw. I had to verse him once during my Mundo journey, and never again. Really hard to play Mundo to this champ as he just completely shreds you, especially if he's not behind. You're going to really struggle to team fight up against this champion. And support, it's going to be champions that are really hard to run into. So champs like Braum, if they have Cog Lulu, it's pretty much GG for you. But champs like Braum are really hard in general, even if they don't have Kog'Maw, because it's so hard to reach anyone and run forward against these champions. Now we're going to be wrapping up this video with the main takeaways, and I've broken it down into 3 key points that I want you to keep fresh in your mind before you queue up for that Mundo game. And the first one's of course going to be, you are a very selfish champion, but you spike extremely hard on one item. So be willing to play selfish to get to that point. And what I mean by that, there's bound to be some action in the early game that you don't want. Your jungler's going to fight for crab or invade or play for grubs. They're going to do some game ruining play that if you get sucked into, it's going to be very bad for you. Where if you can get to Warmogs unscathed, you're going to have a great game. But if you fight grubs and die, or you try to follow your opponent to a scuttle crab fight that you know is bad, just because you're scared your jungler will tilt or something like that, you're going to have a bad time. You need to be even or ahead once you get that Warmog spike, or it's not going to be the same effect. If you get your Warmogs, but the enemy Camille's got Triforce Tiamat with Ignite, you're not going to be able to do anything. So you need to get to that Warmog's point, even or ahead, because once you have it, that switch in your mind needs to flip, and you need to be playing as aggressive as possible. You don't really pressure that hard in the early game, unless you outplay your opponent or you're in a good matchup. So once you have that Warmog spike, and you've got to activate it of course with the Ruby, you need to be running into your opponent. You need to be trading HP with everyone that you can, you need to be blowing up the tower, and really figuring out the limitations of this champion, because you can do so much. You have infinite sustain, so as long as you don't die, the trade is always going to be fine for you, as you can just back off in regen. So don't be afraid to get really messy and attack your opponent under tower, play for plate, and figure out your limitations. And the final point is probably the most important of this entire guide. You are very strong inside. Don't default to being, oh, I'm a tank, I want to group up with my team, keep them safe. Play as selfish as possible inside, blow up all the tier 2s, get a lot of farm. 10 CS per minute blowing up the tier 2s, get as strong as possible, and then translate that lead to the rest of the map. If you can ever hit the tower in front of your opponent, and they can't stop you, proc and demolish, that's one of the most pressuring things you can do, because they have to send more than just that guy to stop you, so make sure you're using that. Now, in a game where you're not that fed and you can't do that, you have a lot of options, and we did touch on that as well, but if you ever can, or if you're ever unsure, you need to go for it and figure out just how much pressure you can create. Alright everyone, that's it for now, and as usual, if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask me in the comments below, and I'm also going to be linking the OPGG of the best Mundo right now in my opinion in my description of this video, so if you want to open it up, get some inspiration from his builds, maybe watch some of his VODs, they can help you as well, but other than that, I'm going to be calling it there, and I'll see you guys next time.